and did that all in 2015. In 2014, I started with Phase 1 pilot training out of Port Prairie, Manitoba. Did all of that on the Rogue, the 120 Alpha over there, which is kind of a light aerobatic airplane. Really what that one is designed to do is just test whether or not you have the ability to learn at a rate that's fast enough for military aviation. And you go through that, you do about 17, 18 hours on the road, and they get you to solo, some basic aerobatics, and that's about it. From there I went back to school, finished my degree, and then did some OJT time up in Cold Lake, Alberta, at 409 Squadron at the time, right before the squadron split 409 and 401. Got a couple backseat rides in the Hornet, puked my guts out constantly on all of those. And then went off and went to Phase 2 flight training in Moose Jaw. Did Phase 2 and then Phase 3 back to back. Got selected onto the fighter stream and got my wings in 2016. So basically 5 years after I joined, I was a wing pilot. Then from there, did some training on the Hawk, CT-155 Hawk, out of Moose Jaw. Went off and continued into Cold Lake on that 419 Squadron. That's where you first start learning how to fight aircraft, essentially. And then following the time in 419 Squadron up in Cold Lake, went off in 2018, started flying the F-18 at 410. Did fighter pilot course, FBC. I was part of FBC 60 there. They're right now on 66. So they did about one every 8 or 9 months, essentially, and completed that in June 2018. From there, I've basically spent the last 4 years at 401 Tactical Fighter Squadron. During my time at 401, I've gotten qualified up as a two-ship lead, QRA commander, so I've done plenty of a NORAD job, basically standing on guard, getting ready to scramble out the door. I've been to operations in Romania back in 2019, where essentially we were bolstering the Eastern Front at that point in time and trying to dissuade any further incursions on that side, helping our partners and allies out there. And then I've also done a fair number of exercises in terms of the fighter force, typical days in the life. You show up, you work whatever time you're needed there, 7, 8, 9, until whenever your day's done. I can vary from a DFM mission, which is going to be a pretty short flight, pretty short brief, all things considered, not a whole ton of mission planning. You might be able to get that all done in 4 or 5 hours for that day, all the way up to an AI, a self-escorted strike mission, which is one of the specialties of the F-18. And that will take you potentially a full day or even longer for just in-unit training. And then when we do training out in broader environments, big multinational exercises, things like that, we have more complex missions. You can go all the way through a 48-hour mission planning cycle, so you can end up spending 48 hours trying to get ready for your hour-and-a-half long flight, which is something that can definitely be a little tiring at times. It's pretty rewarding when you can get everything put it all together and then try and make a mission happen. It's always a little bit like a puzzle, but one that requires a lot of hands and feet, a lot of quick decision making, and getting out there. So it's a nice blend of kind of the mental and physical when you're flying around. With that, if anybody has any questions, I'm more than happy to take them, and then we can kind of go through that. Sure.
Have you ever flown with like a, I guess, weapons officer?
Oh yeah. I mean, we fly with them all the time. Every squadron has at least one. I know you were just talking to Ryan here recently. He's obviously just completed Top Gun. He finished top of his class, which is pretty impressive. He's now off in Ottawa, helping with some future fighter stuff. But we fly, we train with weapons officers all the time. We're not running too many courses right now, just with the waning of the F-18 fleet as we get ready for the next stuff. But yeah, it's extremely common, and basically everybody will fly with them. Everybody will train with them, and the whole point is we're all on the same team together. So we're all simply trying to make each other better all the way through. I know that a lot of people think there's a lot of competition between candidates to try and get the spot that they want, people to try and work through. The biggest thing about flight training in general here is it's not a cutthroat game. Even when there is competition, even when there are limited spots, the best way to work your way through that is really to work together, try and make yourself better by working with other people, and try and make them better by working with you. And even when there are limited spots, typically these things have a way of working themselves out pretty well, so everybody gets what they want, what they need out of it. Where things start to go wrong is when people try and withhold their information. Those are usually the people who don't do quite as well in the end. Anybody else?
Yeah. As a demo pilot, are you going to fly in Abbotsford?
I am, yeah. So I've been doing the demo gig now since April. I've got 18 flights to work up through it. I know that public affairs always has a big problem when I say this, but I was lucky enough to be selected to do that this year. But honestly, I fully believe that anybody about my same level of experience would be able to fly the routine with given training that you get. It's not that it's not difficult, and it's just that everybody's proven themselves to have the learning curve on that. So I'll be going off, I'll be doing the demo routine. It's a lot of fun. Not exactly the normal day of life, but I get to go around, do air shows, talk with people like yourselves here. So it's a lot of fun doing that.
What's your favorite part of those demo flights, like favorite maneuver?
Yeah, I think my favorite maneuver for sure is the square loop. So that's when basically come in. Are you guys familiar with what corner speed is?
No, we don't really have that.
So it's the speed at which essentially you're able to get the maximum turn rate and minimum turn radius at the same time. So in the Hornet, in most of the configurations that I'm flying in, it's going to be about 325 knots. And so I'll come in basically right at corner speed and then pull straight up into pure vertical. Go straight up for a little bit and then pull straight so I basically come across inverted. Hold that for about 10 or so seconds and then pull straight down at the ground and then basically recover at 2,500 feet. So playing straight down, full afterburner, and pull up to recover 2,500 feet so that you end up about 500 feet AGL when all said and done.
Don't try that in a 152 in the practice area.
Yeah. The numbers have to be run pretty tightly in order to figure it out, and there's a whole bunch of caveats on how that all works. But just the ground rush as you're doing that, it's pretty impressive. So that's probably my favorite maneuver. Anybody else? Maybe somebody from over in Comox?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Is it true that the Air Force prefers to take pilots or potential pilots with no experience as opposed to have somebody who already has a private or commercial pilot license?
No, actually, we have a whole bunch of programs to try and get people in who already have some training. The biggest thing they're looking for, and the reason that some people think that is because sometimes when you're going through certain training systems, or you get really comfortable in your job, you might not be as quick to take up the same learning curve that you once did. So I had, I used to have people who were going through phase 2 flight training who had 3,000 hours of commercial license, who had some difficulties, especially in things that they hadn't necessarily done before, like formation flying, because they just had so much experience and so much time in that they didn't have to really focus on the IFR training. They didn't have to focus on the clear hood stuff because they knew how to attitude fly already, and all of those basics were already there. So then when they got something new, they didn't have the study habits back, so they could get ready and get back into it. But actually, the way our training system is set up is that if you already have a commercial pilot's license, they'll actually skip you through phase 1 flight training altogether. So you don't even need to do that one. Those go directly to phase 2. And if you have a private pilot's license, they actually just give you a couple fewer hours. So they skip 2 missions on phase 1. And if you have, I believe it's more than 50 hours, you're in middle license. If you have more than 50 hours flying, they'll skip you through those 2 missions. Just because they assume you already know how to attitude fly, you already know a whole bunch about how aviation works, and they're just testing your learning curve rather than necessarily your ability to fly at that point.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm assuming you guys have to train a lot. What is like kind of like your local practice area?
Okay, so I'm in Cold Lake right now, and we are probably the best practice area in the Western world. Cold Lake's in kind of the middle of nowhere, which has its downsides in other parts. But the big upside is that the practice area out there is absolutely fucking enormous. It is basically the size of Western Europe. So you take off, and in literally 2 minutes, you're in your practice area. I think at first extent, it's about 350 miles wide, about 200 miles long, and that's all fair game to fight in. Our actual range where you can shoot stuff and drop bombs is a little smaller than that. It's only like 40 miles long and 100 miles wide. So, it's you're a little restricted for that. But, we're doing pretty well on that front. So, practice area is enormous, and it just gives you a ton of options. You're clear from the surface to infinity with that, and in fact, our partners and allies actually come out there pretty often, because if they want to do big missile tests, then what's a good place that's clear surface to infinity? You can fire a missile 80 miles. Cold Lake. What's a good place to go and do your strafing practice? Cold Lake. So we've had a lot of good exercises out there, a lot of good training opportunities. Anybody else?
What kind of navigation stuff do you do in the fighter? Like, do you ever use the E6B?
I'll be honest with you. I haven't used an E6B since probably Musha going through, but the basics are really important. Getting used to learn that. You end up having to learn a lot of mental math as you go along, because you often don't have time to pull something out. As you start getting faster and faster, the biggest jump between airplanes when you're going through, especially the basic flight training side of it, before you get into the fighting side, is dealing with things that happen at a faster and faster and faster rate. So it's the same basics of flying, but now you have to keep thinking ahead each time. So the time it takes to try and calculate something, you end up having to find yourself shortcuts. So instead of using the E6B to figure out what winds are, you just realize that if you have 30-degree crosswind, it's going to be 50% of the factor. 60 degrees is about 70%, 75%. And you just come up with quick mental shortcuts that will help you through all of that. In terms of the navigation equipment itself, the point of it is actually stacked it. It's got a laser ring gyro INS that will tell you the exact attitude that you're flying at through all flight regimes. With the INS itself, even without a GPS, you can be accurate to within half a mile anywhere on the Earth. It only drifts half a mile an hour. So, and you can always update it as you're flying along. You're like, oh, there's that lake. Find it on the radar. Find that exact point, and then have your INS re-updated with exactly where you are on Earth. Get that re-cage down nice and tight. So there's a whole bunch of different ways to do that. Plus, when you've got the GPS that does that constantly, multiple times a second. So the navigation becomes easier and easier. The key thing about the Hornet is as much as the flying is extremely important, the main thing that you're doing in the Hornet is using it as a weapon system. You're using it as a platform for other things. You're trying to get your mission to be accomplished. And so the less time you have to focus on flying the plane and navigating it to where you want, and all those other basic skill sets, the more time you're able to focus on the mission and your timeline. You have to deal with literal rocket science to figure out when they would have shot you, how close you can get to them, so that you can fly away before the missile comes in towards you. All of these basic things you have to do on the fly constantly. And so if you're not having to worry about the hands and feet of flying as much on that, it makes your life way easier. So the Hornet is actually the easiest plane I've ever flown. It auto trims to 1G, you put it at an angle, you let go of the stick, it'll just keep flying that way. It's fly by wire, so the whole thing that the Hornet does is, let's say you're a voting member when you're flying the F-18. So you pull back on the stick, and the stabs don't move. You pull back on the stick, and the computer figures out, okay, you're in this flight regime, you're doing this, you want to go bring your nose that way, how am I going to do this? And it will change the flaps, and it will change the stabs, and it will change the ailerons, and it will do everything. And then we'll try it, and then a 20th of a second later, it'll go, that wasn't working quite as well as I wanted it to, and we'll change it again. We'll just keep doing that. So you can be completely stalled in the F-18 and have full nose authority. You'll be falling out of the sky, you'll be going more than 18,000 feet a minute straight down, but you'll be able to keep your nose pointing exactly where you want it to. And they'll move the stick and it'll just go, okay, I'll follow you along. There's also a little, it almost feels like a video game sometimes in certain respects, because some call it pirouette, where you invoke certain logics on the flight controls. They basically figured out a way to do certain things that the plane shouldn't otherwise be able to do. So are you guys familiar with what a hammerhead is in aerodynamics? So that's where you, figures my hand use here. So you kind of go up and you stall, or you just about stall the plane, and then you kick over the rudder to drop the nose down, and basically inducing an incipient spin, essentially. Then you come out and you recover. The Hornet can do something similar to that, a little different, called a pirouette, which is where you're pulling and you go straight up, and you can basically cause the Hornet to turn around on itself, just like that, in whatever regime it is. And if you meet a certain few characteristics, like a less than 210 knots, or above 25 degrees angle of attack, you do the exact right inputs to get this to happen, it will just kick the nose around in a way that it reasonably shouldn't.
Is that also like referred to as Kirchhoff's bell? I might have the name wrong.
It might be, but the way that it actually works in the Hornet is it doesn't actually stall the plane. It just basically they figured out in the flight control software how to do this so that without stalling the plane, it will just send the nose swinging wildly around, which is honestly a lot of fun to do. And it helps with dogfighting in certain circumstances.
So with stalling the plane, I know with stalling, of course, comes like relative airflow and all that. But if you're going real fast and you pitch up, but you're going fast enough that the relative airflow is still right in line, like how does that affect the critical angle of attack?
So the critical angle of attack is always going to be dependent, as you said, on a bunch of different factors. The airspeed is obviously going to be paramount in that, to a certain degree. But essentially, so on the Hornet, we have a 35 altitude fighter. So the critical angle of attack is always 35 altitude. But you can fly it out to 55 or 60 alpha and still be in complete control of the airplane. Because when you actually exceed the critical angle of attack, you don't fully stop producing lift. You just don't produce as much as you previously produced. And typically, because of the way that the airflow sheds off of the wing at that point, on most planes you'll end up losing control of your control surfaces because they're no longer actually in contact with the airflow in a sufficient way for you to be able to properly control it. which is where you end up in a stall, and then if you keep doing things, you end up in the incipient spin, and then spin if you keep holding it, right? In the Hornet, you have the benefit of you not being the one who figures out the flight controls at that point in time. So, along with having the Lex leading edge extensions, which basically produce an artificial delta wing. So, if you've ever seen pictures of the bakes coming off of the Lex, but those are essentially vortices that will then go and fall back over the wings and re-energize the airflow over the wings to then provide additional airflow over the control surfaces, which will then allow you to still remain in some control. There's a lot of interesting aerodynamics that goes on with that. But all that to say, just because you've lost lift doesn't mean you necessarily lose control over your control surfaces. Same reason why, you know, Canard will essentially never be able to stall, because the loss of lift will still allow the front controls to continue going unless you stall those, which is almost impossible by design on those. So, hope that answered your question.
Have you ever intercepted anyone?
Yeah, I've been on actually plenty of intercepts. Never gotten too close. I don't have any of those great photos where you're sitting in the cockpit and you've got a bear bomber behind you and you can digital selfie. But yeah, I've been up there when we've had bears, Sukhois, blackjacks, both in Romania and up north in Canada. You know, you go up there, you meet them, and try and stay professional. And just show that we're able to defend our sovereignty and defend the sovereignty of NATO as well.
When you do intercept like 92, 95 air bombers and stuff up there, like what are they doing? Like what are they?
So, how do I phrase this? It's a bit of a game of cat and mouse to a certain extent. So, they're testing what our response is to them. So, are you familiar with the difference between an ADIZ, Air Defense Identification Zone, a territorial waters, an exclusive economic zone? Familiar with the difference of how each of these works at all?
Vaguely, but not really.
Yeah, we
So-
know like the limitations for the ADIS, but
Yes. So essentially an ADIS is a line in the sky that any country can draw basically anywhere it wants. It doesn't actually hold any legal bounds outside of what somebody with a pilot's license is supposed to do within those circumstances. That's just where a country says, if you're coming here, you need to be identified, you need to be following those rules. But if, say, another country decides that they don't want to do that, there's nothing that you can do about it, necessarily. In terms of, they haven't broken any international law in that case. There's then a territorial waters, which extend 12 nautical miles off of the coast. And that is essentially like its land. That is your country. Your country owns it, full stop. So any aircraft, any vessel, anything that enters that area with malicious intent, without permission, that technically is an act of war. So there's that. And there's the exclusive economic zone, which is typically via UNCLOS, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. That extends 200 nautical miles beyond your coastline, essentially. And so that isn't actually territorial waters, that's just where you have the exclusive right to extract resources, be that fishing, mining, oil, all of that stuff. So you have the right to defend your assets, but any country can go outside of 12 nautical miles, but within those 200, that's all fair game for them to travel around. Also a whole bunch of rules about innocent passage and things like that, which all come into effect. So all of these, you know, essentially what they're doing is they're entering the ADIS, or what we call the CADIS, and testing our response, but staying outside of the 12 nautical mile territorial waters. So they're never entering into our territory. So everything that's happening there is legal, technically. There's no international law being violated at that point. But we, as a sovereign country, have said that anybody who enters within our defense identification zone that isn't actively, permitted to do so will be responded to. And so that's exactly what we're doing. We're providing a response to that by flying up the unit there. To be fair, they're not the only countries that do that, right? China has declared their air defense identification zone over between the Taiwan Straits, right? And so whenever the US, for example, or Canada, as happened with our frigates recently, transits in between those, that's entering their, identification zones, but it's still within international waters and completely legal to do so. And so, I suppose what you could say is it's a way of different people keeping each other honest about that and testing certain capabilities.
Semi-related, would that mean like U-2 spy plane flights are technically an act of war if they're crossing over, let's say, Cuba or something? Because
I'll let you draw what you want to conclude off of that yourself.
I would think with the U2 being 60,000+ feet, that it might actually be some rationale.
So there is a maximum height, but it's well above 60,000 feet.
I guess just a totally unrelated question. So when you were younger, did you thought you were gonna ever be a pilot, and then when you got in, did you think you were gonna go fighters? What?
I mean,
when you were growing up.
yeah. So it's tough. I remember joining the Air Cadets at 12 and thinking that was just something so far out of the realms of possible, right? And then keep going through, and all of you guys have made it onto the Howard Scholarship, obviously. So you know what it took to get here. You know all the steps that it took, and how much time, how much energy, how much effort, all the tests, everything. And I'm sure each of you at some point has thought that, this probably isn't going to work out, or you've done badly, then you keep going and you end up going further and further. I remember being on the glider and having the F-18 show up, and thinking about how cool that was, and people pretending because it was all secret squirrel there. Oh, that F-18 doesn't exist. Don't look at it. And I was like, that'd be so cool. And then I joined and go through college and kind of away from aviation for a little bit. And everybody's telling you to keep going through the pilot training system. You're not a pilot until you have your wings. You're always 2 flights away from the end of your career. All that type of stuff. But to say there was never any doubts is probably too self-aggrandizing. There's always going to be doubt. There's always going to be tough times. The thing is, it's not about whether or not you'll face challenges. Almost everybody I know, actually every pilot I know, has failed at least one flight. And it's not about how it's not about never failing. It's not about being perfect all the time, people have bad days. It's about how you respond to those bad days, how you respond to those failed flights. Some people I've seen kind of devolve back and, seclude themselves, and when they have a bad time, they, pull back, and then they focus on that, and they stress themselves out, and they don't. What I found works a lot better for me is going out, being honest, talking with your your course mates about what went wrong, what went right, asking for their opinions, talking to your instructors, and seeing how to improve, and then carrying on from that. The worst thing you can do is try and solve everything by yourself. Try and, fix it all on your own. Because in aviation, you won't have the opportunity to make all the mistakes yourself. A lot of the rules are written in blood. A lot of the skill sets that have been attained were only attained through a lot of trial and a lot of other people's error over that time period. And you'd be foolish not to take advantage of the fact that a lot of the questions you have already been answered along the way. And so getting out there, talking open and honestly, the best thing about the Air Force flight training system is it selects the people who can put their ego aside and say, yeah, I screwed this up. This is where I went wrong. This is where I need to improve, and then talk to everybody about it so that nobody else on their course makes that same mistake. Nobody else on their course will, have the same problem. In fact, it's really, courses are really looked down upon. When one person makes a mistake, that's considered normal. When a second person makes that same mistake, it's considered a failure of the course for them not knowing it by that point. So being open and honest with each other is going to be your best bet here. And if you ever decide to continue forward into the Air Force, if that's something that you wanted to do, keep that in mind, that you do better by working together. Now that kind of helps answer the question.
I guess, thanks, Jess. And then, I guess follow-up question, since on the other end, it's our unit flight safety officer.
Yeah.
So the whole point of the summer has been trying to promote, open and honest communication and stuff like that. The question for you is, through your aviation career so far, what's the most oopsie flight safety moment you had?
Yeah, so I actually was the unit flight safety officer over at 401 right before I took over as the demo pilot. I'm pretty familiar with flight safety systems, and I'm a big fan of it. It's, again, really important so we don't make the same mistakes again and again. I've had a few mistakes in my time for sure, over speeds, over stresses, different things like that, but there's been a couple times, even on phase one, I came closer than I would have liked to some pretty catastrophic incidents there. As part of phase one, you do spins in the grove. You only start off at 7,000 feet there, which I know probably sounds like a reasonable altitude to you guys right now, but 7,000 feet is a little scary in the Hornet. Obviously wasn't flying the Hornet right now, or right then, but on that one, we entered into the spin, went through the proper recovery. It was actually my instructor demoing that spin to me. And the aircraft just wouldn't recover. We just kept descending and kept spinning. And as I'm sure you guys are all well aware, you lose altitude pretty quick in a spin. And so there's not a whole lot of opportunity to fix that. I guess it was just that the CUG was too aft, the way it was. And so, luckily, we were able to get out of that. The instructor actually ended up rocking us out of the spin, which is not exactly the standard method of getting out of those, but it did work in the end. And I think we ended at 7,000, and we recovered at like 2,400, which was pretty low, given that the ground was about 1,000 feet there. So that wasn't great. And then a couple flights later, there were big wildfires over in Russia that year, back in 2014. And so all the smoke had transited across and was now sitting right over southern Manitoba at the time. And so we took off in flight in hopes that maybe the weather was sufficient. It's all attitude flying on phase one, just like what you're doing right now. And if you don't have a horizon, obviously it's pretty tough to attitude fly. So we took off, and my instructor decided that there was insufficient weather for us to continue. So the policy there is the moment they call the flight off, the instructor takes control and they fly it back, so that you don't get an unfair advantage, additional stick time, or we don't learn some bad lessons from that time that you're flying through. And so we had taken off with the expectation that the runways were going to swap, because the winds were coming from an unforecast direction, and it was forecast to swing around any moment now. As we're coming back, my instructor ended up getting into an argument with a more senior instructor over the radio about whether or not it had met conditions. These were all civilians at the flight training school there, in phase one. And as we came through, that argument was taking place while they were listening to the ATIS, which is called the active runway. In Portage, there's a key difference on which pattern you're going to, and the difference is the wording by the loop versus over the loop. So if you're coming back by the loop, you're not over the loop, and if you're coming back over the loop, then you are, and that will determine which runway you're going to be entering the pattern for. And being that this is phase one, and they're assessing how well you correct for errors, the big thing that you're trying to do is be on exactly the right line, be on exactly the right altitude, follow the exact right parameters this whole time. So we were exactly at 1,900 feet. We were exactly following this line, and we were going between all these points. Super snowy, so there's maybe 2-ish miles of visibility, right bordering on if it's even legally VFR right now. But we're flying along, and because we didn't hear the ATIS, and because ATC didn't pick up on us calling by the loop versus over the loop, we ended up entering the pattern in exactly 180 degrees from each other. So there was another aircraft that was in the pattern, and there was us, and that aircraft is being flown by one guy who's trying to fly that exact perfect line and be exactly right on altitude. We're trying to fly that exact line, we're on the exact perfect line, be exactly on the right altitude. And it's the same line, it's the same altitude, and so we're just converging. And luckily, we had a TCAS system in the Grove. Are you guys familiar with TCAS? So basically what it is it takes the mode 3 returns and populates them on your screen. So if you can know where any other aircraft that's walking mode 3 is within a certain region from you, and it will provide you a kind of map of where they are. And so as we're flying along, I'm seeing this little dot get closer and closer on the TCAS. And my instructor is seeing that too. And so what he does is he hands me back control of the plane so that he can better look outside. Interesting decision to make. But either way, so he hands me back control of the plane. And I'm looking outside, and I'm trying to fly my perfect line and find my perfect altitude. And we're just watching this get closer and closer and closer. So finally, it's getting into the red line, which is, I think, within 2 nautical miles. And you're doing about 120 knots at this point in time. Each. So that's 240 knots of closure. And I see this, and it's getting within that point, and I go, okay, I'm done with this. So I start diverging to the right, 2 head-on aircraft, each turns to the right. Just as I start my turn to the right, I notice a couple of whirling blades of death in front of me, of the other plane, as he said to turn to the left. And so he's now finally big enough that I can see him silhouetted, and he's close enough that I can see the helmet that he's wearing, the visor, and all of that good stuff. And so we're now back on a collision course because he's turning left and I'm turning right. And then I end up having to do like a 135-degree bailout slice from 1,000 feet a little bit. Well, my instructor and I did it exactly at the same time, which is, you know, somewhat encouraging, I suppose. So that was the second time, right close afterwards, where I ended up in a little bit of a spicy situation and battling each other. But again, when we think about that last one, if you think about this from a flight safety perspective, what are some things that you might be able to improve upon with this? You know, do you think of some improvements?
I mean, even listening to the ATIS twice,
Yeah, listen to the ATIS for sure. But what's the root cause of us not listening to the ATIS?
arguments.
Exactly. Should you be arguing in the cockpit with somebody else? Probably not. Probably should you be doing that while you're doing something else in a critical time of flight, like when you're listening to ATIS? Probably not. So that would be a good thing. What are the dynamics at the flight school right there, where that was considered something that was reasonable to happen? Is there a problem with the culture? Is there a problem with the environment at that point in time? That's something that might need to be looked at, right? And can I think some other things?
I mean, like making sure you have VFR visibility.
Yeah, I mean, something as basic as, should we have taken off in the first place that day? We knew that the weather was bad, it's been smoky for days and weeks. And why did we take off? Was it because, you know, after a couple days of not flying, everybody's got a time frame that they have to meet, everybody's got, you know, I know that some of you guys have had canceled flights today. It's probably a good thing, right? I mean, we know that the weather isn't great outside today. We know that it might not be the best environment to learn. Even if it's legal, or they're calling it legal. I think they were calling 3 miles when we took off that day at the ground. So that's legally VFR. But does it make sense? Probably not. Should we continue pressing with that? Should we rely on the forecast? How about thinking a little bit more broadly? Should terms?
Well, I mean, I think that kind of emphasizes the importance of like higher ups as well in making them.
Exactly. And so part of the issue that day, what the argument was about, was we had made the PIREP that it was insufficient to continue flying out there. And the more senior instructor was arguing that it was sufficient to continue flying. And so he was trying to overrule that so flights could continue for the day. And so that was what the actual content of that argument was. But you can also think about things more broadly in terms of what are the procedures? Do these procedures make sense? Does it make sense to rely on ATC catching the difference between over the loop and by the loop on the radio? Is that good comm to have in place right there? Maybe not. Maybe we should have things that sound more different, so that if you miss something and you just barely catch a bit of it, you don't go, oh yeah, that's probably fine. They know what they're doing, right? Maybe if I'm coming in downwind for this runway, that might be a better piece of comm for that. It might take a little longer, but it might make more sense. So these are all the types of things you have to think of in flight safeties, where when you're investigating them, you try and find what the root cause or causes of the incident were, because usually there's more than one, right? Took a lot of different things, maybe not going quite as they should have, for us to end up in that situation. And if any one of those things had changed, I would be telling you this story right now. And luckily we were able to get out of that one okay. And you know, the basic principle of look outside and see that you're not going to hit something, seen be seen, did work out in the end. But maybe it's a good thing that we had the TCAS system there, because that prompted us to keep looking there, instead of maybe looking away at one of the references to make sure that I'm exactly on my line, while the other guy's looking away at one of his references to make sure he's exactly on the line, during that split second when we actually had the visual depth to actually see what we were going towards.
This is not really directly flight safety related, but I was just wondering, because it was a civilian flight school, what aircraft were you flying?
It was the Grove. So,
Sorry, what was it?
the Grove 120?
Prop 120.
Yeah, the Grove 120 Alpha is the, so that's the phase 1 flight training. The way that the military flight school is set up right now is that really everything through the Hawk is under some combination of public-private partnership. So phase 1 flight training is actually done by civilian instructors at a civilian school on a former military base with the oversight of military standards pilots. Phase 2 is done on the Harvard 2, or what's called the Texas 2 of the States. And that is technically, it's a very complex relationship, but it's military owned, that's been leased back to the civilian company to train us, where a lot of the external support in ground school is done by civilians, but it's all military instructors who will train you on that. And phase 3 is very similar in its setup. So it's an interesting public-private partnership on that.
Cool. Any last questions before get it going?
Do you fly IFR in the Hornet?
Oh yeah, IFR all the time. Hornet's actually beautifully set up for IFR. Unlike training aircraft where the student is the autopilot, you end up having an actual autopilot on that one, so you've got full aerodynamics system as well. And it's probably the best IFR equipped fighter jet in the world, actually. It's got a ton of things, issued ILSs, VORs, TACANs, PARs, which are precision approach radars, where they basically take a radar, fire it at you, and then tell you through a series of headings and altitudes to follow down to the ILS limits, which is a pretty cool approach that isn't available all that often, but it's really helpful if you end up in an emergency. So yeah, we fly IFR all the time. Flew here yesterday IFR 43,000 feet to try and save some gas. And that works out pretty nicely.
And de-icing?
It has engine anti-ice and anti-ice for the pitot tubes and the AOA probes, but the main way to do anti-ice the wings and what have you is with the left hand. So icing is a function of Mach number, and de-icing is a function of Mach number, which is flying around. So as you probably know, your worst setup for icing is on a small wing that's very thin and goes pretty fast, which is exactly what describes the Hornet. But number one, because you've got enough power, and number two, because you can speed up fast enough that the ice basically heats up and falls off, it ends up working out okay for us. So we actually are authorized to fly in moderate ice conditions.
Have you ever flown up high enough that you are, sorry, what's the highest altitude you've flown? And if you, I don't,
The service ceiling of the Hornet is 48,000 feet.
48,000, okay.
So my official answer to you is 48,000 feet.
How long did it take you to get from to here?
I had a pretty strong headwind here yesterday, so it was about an hour and a half.
That's pretty good.
That's probably
Yeah, I mean, it was about an hour and 15, and I flew around a bit over here. So.
Now, when you're doing like upper air work, what kind of altitude do you go up to do that?
So when we're doing BFM flights and things like that, our hard deck is at 5,000 feet. If we're doing some other flights, kind of BVR, within visual range stuff, then we'll clear down to 1,000 feet AGL. But it's going to be what we call limited maneuvering, so there's certain rules about how much you can turn, who could be nose low during the turns, things like that, before you stop the local engagement right there, just for safety factors. And then in terms of the maximum, I've fought all the way up to the service ceiling before, so it'll be climbing and descending. There's a whole bunch of rules about restricted airspaces and how that works and how you can maintain deflections from each other, and that's actually a pretty important thing, especially as the engagements get larger and larger, and you've got 50 airplanes on either side of this fight that are trying to both fight as realistically as you possibly can, but not crash into each other, and how you can maintain that deflection away from each other is really important. But that answer your question? Any last couple? Anything from Comox?
So there, Mike? Don't sleep?
Just maybe one question. You said you flew around a little bit here.
Yeah.
Where's the military training area here?
So there's not actually a military training area directly here. What I was doing there was getting a site recce for the air show. I was checking around, looking at the lines for the show line, trying to figure out if there's going to be any conflicting towers, terrain, things like that on either side of where I'm planning on flying around, doing all that stuff. In terms of military training areas, there are a bunch up in the Comox area, up north, up in the mountains, on the other side of the island, and then the Americans actually just to the south, I guess that's that way, just to the south of here. They're all running a bunch of different training areas out a little further east, and then more out west, and then even more further south. So there's lots of training areas around, but in terms of right here, sweet. Well, it's been a lot of fun talking to you guys. Hope you guys learned a little bit. If you have any questions for me offline, feel free to come up and ask me. But great. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.